Professor Proctor, welcome to the Nuzuri Kahawa Report. We're extremely lucky to have you, and your insight will shed on global warming, but also the migration patterns of global south impacting the economic development of the countries below the equator. So, Professor Proctor, please introduce yourself to the audience and tell us who you are, where you're from, uh, and which subject you taught before retiring, Professor.
Great. Well, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm retired now from Texas Tech University. I was the director of global studies at Texas Tech in the political science department, and I was at Texas Tech for about 30 years. I also spent a couple of years at the Air Force Academy as a visiting professor there, and also had two Fulbrights. One was a group Fulbright that took me to Southeast Asia, and the other was a teaching Fulbright that took me to Bangladesh. And the book that I just published last year is on adaptation to climate change. It's published with Lynn Renner, and it's kind of we got to, if you want me to talk about the book a little bit, it's,
No, Professor.
pardon me?
Absolutely, Professor.
Yeah.
Please do.
Well, there's basically two tasks that I set out when I started writing the book. One was to look at how adaptation had been treated in international negotiations over the years. And I think I found some things by re-examining documents that had been long forgotten that were interesting in how the debate about adaptation to climate change had changed over the years. So I relate some of that and try to give a more picture of the role that adaptation has played in climate policy. And then I was concerned with, well, what does all this mean for contemporary issues? And in particular, on this question of transformation, because in about 10 years ago, we started to see a lot of talk about transformation. The word transformation started to show up in official documents, and it was already before that in the scholarship. And so I tried to take a close look at what transformation would mean in the context of climate adaptation. And I, of course, found a range of definitions and understandings that were circulating out there. So I tried to sort that out a little bit, make it a little bit more systematic as to what had been said on the topic and what really it all meant as far as the future of dealing with the climate challenge. So that was the gist of the book.
Interesting. While mitigation, Professor, focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the global south, especially in Africa, is undergoing rapid economic development and is projected to hit approximately 2.5 billion inhabitants by 2050. So, how do you think the shift from mitigation to adaptation strategies will occur in response to these changes?
Well, that's one of the premises of my book and some of the other things we've written. I've got a co-author, Paul Harris, who lives in Hong Kong, teaches at a university there. And one of the things that we kind of tend to emphasize is just the failure of mitigation policy. It hasn't been a complete loss, but for all the talk and all the attention and time that's devoted to mitigation, which is essentially ways to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, that's the most important part of mitigation. There's other aspects of it as well. A lot of that, of course, is necessarily going to focus on fossil fuels. So you look at the key numbers, like the concentration of greenhouse gas and greenhouse gas equivalents in the atmosphere, or the amount of fossil fuels being burned from year to year. And nothing is going the right direction on that. The Paris Agreement was supposed to make a big difference. That was held in 2015. There was what they call the Conference of the Parties, when all the countries get together to talk about climate policy. And that was supposed to make a big difference. And there was supposed to be all these commitments made to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere and engage in other activities to try to reduce the level of warming. And the initial estimates were that it did have an impact. If you looked at what countries pledged to do, coming out of the Paris Agreement, it should have reduced the amount of global warming by a degree or so from what would have been expected to happen in the absence of the agreement. However, even then, it would have been well above what the international community has decided is the dangerous level of climate warming, which is about 2 degrees increase in the global average temperature, 2 degrees Celsius increase in the global average temperature. It would have been about 2.7, 2.9, maybe 3 degrees with the Paris Agreement in place and respected. Now, there's an organization that looks at actual policy and what are countries actually doing, and they consistently put the probable path, even with the climate agreement in place several tenths of a degree higher than that. So if 2 degrees is the threshold before we start experiencing dangerous climate change, as the documents call it, then we're going to be in 3-degree territory. So we'll be well past that. And now that is down from some of the higher estimates that were given about what we would hit by the end of the century, which was about 4 degrees by the end of the century. Now, given all the setbacks with climate policy over the last 5 years or so, and of course, the current administration in the United States has withdrawn the country from the climate agreement again, second time, we may be back on the path to rising amounts of fossil fuels being burned, thus more concentration in the atmosphere, and thus maybe instead of 2.9 degrees or 2.7 degrees, 3.5 degrees of Celsius of warming on a global average. Now, with Africa in particular, you're exactly right that if we're going to bring 2.5 billion people, which I believe is almost a doubling of the population, and plus bring them in instead of, as we know now, half the people in the continent don't even have access to running water, in another 20, 30 years, if development were to proceed as the way it should, then we would see, as we already do in Africa, modern cities with plenty of cars and plenty of power plants and all the rest. That would then mean that Africa, instead of being a region that has made hardly any contribution to the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, could become a significant part of that. Now, of course, the remedy for that is to embark on a path of renewables now. There's no reason why Africa has to install coal-fired power plants all across the continent and then replace them down the road with solar and wind, when they can just install the solar and wind now. So now that, of course, takes commitments from the international community to provide the funding, and it takes the political context, and plus you've got African countries that are major oil producers, so they may not be altogether on board with that plan anyway. So, and then of course that brings us to my concern, which is with adaptation, because if we are looking at such things as Africa becoming, and of course other parts of the world as well, Africa, Asia, becoming bigger contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, then we're going to see temperatures rise. And then the question of adaptation becomes all the more important for not just Africa, but for the rest of the world. I hope that.
Interesting, Professor. Yeah, absolutely. I have a twofold question.
Okay.
So how does global politics influence climate change? And that's A. And B, what are some key disparities between the global north and developing countries, given that the latter suffers most from the climate change despite contributing the least to emissions?
I didn't quite catch the first part of your question.
So the first part of the question is, how does global politics in the international stage influence climate change? And what are some key disparities between the global north and global south, given that the global north global south contributes the least to emissions?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right.
Now.
And every academic paper practically, and every, that even touches on these issues of development, every international conference, everyone talks about the obligations of the developed countries, because the historic contribution, of course, of a country like the United States is much higher than any other country. Now, the United States, of course, looking out for its own self-interest, wants to emphasize current contributions and not historic contributions. But the fact is that the United States developed, as did many other developed countries, on the fossil fuel economy. So it made its big contribution, and now they turn around and say, well, what we did, you can't do because it's going to hurt the environment. Well, that would suggest that countries like the United States and Europe and others that have benefited so greatly from the fossil fuel economy should be helping out significantly financially other countries to both move towards green energy and to adapt to the inevitable warming that's coming. So that difference between the North and South is very significant, and it's played out throughout in the negotiations as well. Because I was looking at documents that were describing each of the successive conferences of the parties. So you could see the development of the dialogue going on, and you could see how increasingly that question of the obligation of the developed countries to help the developing countries was central to the whole debate. It may not have been entirely as strong at the outset of the discussions when people were still kind of getting their feet and there wasn't as much of a problem. Now, that's another thing that's changed. When negotiations started, the amount of temperature rise was barely detectable. It was just a problem that people knew was coming because we knew the physics. And now, we're seeing the impact. We're at 1.5 degree temperature increase compared to pre-industrial, and we're seeing the extreme storms and the flooding and the droughts and having significant impact. Yeah, so the developing is a major line of discussion. And to get down to some numbers, it took a long time for the developing countries to get the North to admit to or accept a responsibility for its part in causing the problem and then dealing with it. But they finally did, and they got commitments from the developed countries to provide a fund of about $100 billion per year to help out with climate policy, and that's mitigation measures and adaptation. Most of the money's gone to mitigation. But that fund was never fully funded, never fully financed. It never got up to the $100 billion. I think a couple, 3 years ago, in one of the conference of the parties' meetings, there was an agreement to actually increase that to $200 billion. So we may see, if commitments follow, we may see something there. But of course, if the United States is backed out, and I can expect this administration, look what they're doing to this country. They're hardly going to be spending money when they've destroyed USAID and are now working on slashing budgets all across the United States. I can't see them making much of a contribution to a climate fund. And that matters because the United States still has the largest economy in the world. It has also the largest responsibility for historic emissions. Also should be a big player in helping developing countries deal with the problem. It's a moral, political obligation, but it's just not going to happen. Okay, so the funding is going to fall short. I think that's pretty clear of need. And by the way, this fund, when I say it's set at $100 billion and has been for some time and then may have been increased recently, it's still well short of any reasonable estimate of need, which can range anywhere from $500 billion a year to $1 trillion a year of what would actually be needed to implement all the needed mitigation measures as well as adaptation measures to deal with the climate problem. So that's where we stand on the North-South and the financing. I mean, we can talk about how that dialogue has changed a little bit as well.
Interesting. Well, will China assume leadership on climate change now that Washington has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement?
That's a really good question, because China, about 15 years ago or so, adopted this policy of striving for what they call ecological civilization. So China actually wants to be seen in some ways as a leader in ecological and environmental affairs. Now, my good friend Paul Harris, that I just mentioned, living in Hong Kong, is pretty well in touch with what the Chinese government is actually up to, and he considers it just a massive form of greenwashing, that the Chinese government does not really intend to thwart economic growth in any way or slow economic growth in any way, and it'll do whatever it can to keep economic growth going, and the environment will definitely take a second place to that. Now, I think the Chinese government official view is that development is still the number one priority because they still have several hundred million people living in poverty. So when they reach that stage that they feel comfortable around that, then they shift over to being a lot more ecologically conscious and developing what they call this ecological civilization, which they hope is a world leader, not just China, but that it sets an example for the rest of the world for a more ecologically sound global society. Now, that's the way I understand what they're up to. Some scholars like what they're doing and really praise it. Others, besides Paul, others that are writing on this, feel that it is kind of a show. It doesn't really have much content to it. However, we can look at some things that China has done. For instance, they're now the number one producers of electric vehicles. So evidently they found a way to make them at a reasonable price, and they're going all over the world. So if electric vehicles is a step forward, then they're basically, probably for monetary reasons, for profit reasons, but for whatever reason, they're at the forefront of that market. And from what I understand, they are in fact taking some steps towards shifting their own economy towards solar and wind and the like, because they've been a very coal dependent economy for a long time. But of course, you can only depend on coal so much, and then the air just gets too nasty. And so what I understand, they have taken steps to try to get away from that dependency on that real highly polluting source of energy. So it's hard to say. Definitely, though, with the United States stepping out, we had a few years there where the Biden administration was trying to take a leadership role in global environmental affairs, but it comes and goes with change of administration in this country, even before Trump ever appeared. But that's going to leave a void in that area. That's a policy area where China can definitely step up. And as far as Africa is concerned, you probably are very aware that China is deeply involved in Africa and is funding infrastructure projects and the like. So they could very well have a significant influence.
And how about the Europeans? I mean, is the economic, well, let's just not forget, EU as a whole is an economic and political behemoth.
Yeah.
I mean, what does...
Yeah, they do. They have that much weight. I think the size of the European Union economy collectively is about the same as the U.S., if not larger. And they're, because of the direction of American foreign policy right now, they're pulling together more than they were before. They realize that they're not going to have the United States to rely on for very much, so they're going to have to pull together amongst themselves. And they have the weight, and they are almost all committed to effective climate change policy. That's something that the Europeans, they accept the science, they accept the responsibility. Now, of course, it always is prey to politics and budgetary concerns and all the rest, but I think that if China steps forward as an ecological civilization exemplar, if Europe carries through with the commitments it's made over the years to help cope with global warming, I think you could see some strong effort on that side. It's just going to hurt to have the largest economy, well, second largest now, but one of the largest economies on the planet in the United States with its influence on the sidelines. And it's always going to come down to money. I mean, if you look at the negotiations, where do they come down? It's on finance and money. The developing countries, they've got other concerns. They've still got a lot of poverty. They still want to develop their economies and their societies. And so to be able to provide extra funding for climate change policy, they try to turn to the richer countries, and then all the debates and so forth over that ensue.
Well, I guess segueing that topic, climate adaptations in Africa often relies on external funding from Western nations and international institutions. Do you think this reliance perpetuates, a neo-colonial economic order where African states are forced into dependency rather than genuine climate resilience?
That's a really tough question. I can't promise that I know enough about the African case in particular to be able to answer it fully. I can say this. You are right that for funding climate change projects like emissions control and adaptation projects and the like, there is a strong inclination to turn towards outside funders, whether that be foreign aid or be multilateral development banks, whatever it happens to be. The Global Environmental Fund also provides money. And there's an adaptation fund as well. So there are these outside sources, and there's a lot of focus on Africa for good reason. Even though, sorry, I'm going to cough.
No, you're good.
If you had a button, I wanted to let you know. Okay.
No, you're good.
You got to be able to edit. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think what's going to happen, though, is people are going to have to adjust. One of the things with Africa is that even though the temperature won't rise as much as other regions, because of the vulnerability of African societies to climate change, there's going to be a lot of disruption. That's the way climate investigators look at that, I think, at the African situation. Actually, the greatest temperature increases will occur at the poles, and there's a whole variety of reasons for that. Already, I mean, I grew up in Alaska, and already you can see from the retreat of glaciers that's been going on for a long time, and I have not seen this personally, but my family members tell me that if you get outside of town where there's permafrost, the permafrost is melting. So the trees are falling over. They're leaning over. And so this has been going on for a while. So that's what's happening in northern areas. And that's because there is a much more warming toward the poles. Now, Africa obviously is not polar, but it also has some vulnerable areas, such as dry areas, the Sahel, that can be heavily impacted by drought and the like, and also because of the low level of development, low per capita income and the like, it's considered to be especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and to lack the social resilience to bounce back from big events or ongoing changes to growing patterns and the like. So that's why Africa actually is a big focus of climate policy. And that means that draws the attention of the NGOs and the multilateral development banks and the foreign aid agencies and all the rest. And, all that stuff has kept Africa in a kind of a neo-colonial position for decades and decades already. It's probably in the area of climate change, I don't know that it would be as acute because what you're doing there is not the same as, say, building a new textile factory or whatever. It's not really engaged in quite the same way, but it nevertheless does retain those elements of post-colonial society and independency. But here's the thing. This is going to be true not just in Africa, it's going to be true everywhere. Adaptation is something that takes place largely at the local level. That's by contrast to mitigation. Mitigation deals with the whole atmosphere. We're all under one atmosphere, and we're all putting greenhouse gases in that atmosphere, and we're all experiencing climate change as a result of that. So that's something that has to be dealt as an international collective action problem. There has to be some way to get all the countries to agree on some mechanism by which they will reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and stabilize the climate. And that if anybody defects from that and doesn't play by the rules, then that causes the whole system to start to unravel. And of course, it leads others to say, well, why should I play by the rules when this other country's not playing by the rules? That means I'm carrying the burden and they're not carrying the burden. That's just a classic prisoner's dilemma type collective action problem. But with adaptation, we're going to experience climate modification, the changes to the climate. We're going to experience that where we live, right? I mean, we're going to experience that in our homes, in our regions, in our communities. And so a lot of that is going to take place at the local level. You don't have that same kind of collective action issue. The collective action issue comes in again on the financing, which is, well, if we're going to deal with it effectively, then some folks are going to need more help. They aren't going to be able to handle it locally because they won't have the resources. And so we've got to make sure that we provide funds and so forth. And so this is more of a straight transfer of income and wealth from one community to another. Now, that's not to say it's not due, or it's not charity. It may be an obligation that's owed, but nevertheless, it's a transfer more than it is a collective action problem. And those are especially hard to arrange because it really feels like a zero-sum game, like one side gets something and the other side gives it up. And that's really hard politically to get through. But what it means is there's two conclusions to draw from that. One, such adaptation as occurs will probably not require a lot of outside funding. But when it does, it's going to be really hard to get it, at least in the right amounts, in the amounts you need. It's always going to be short. It's always going to be insufficient. And so now I think you raised this a little bit earlier. Where this can start to really hurt, though, and really bite is if the impacts are so great that adaptation in place really is not feasible. For instance, if some area that's already maybe an arid part of the continent is experiencing year after year after year of drought. And maybe that's the permanent condition now because of higher temperatures. Maybe in the Sahel or maybe in other areas in Africa, that's the case. People are going to have to move, right? I mean, they're not going to stay where they can't make a living in any feasible way. And so that's why one of the main concerns is the movement of people that might come out of vulnerable parts of the world, even more so than we're already seeing for economic reasons. In fact, they're saying, people that research this say we already are experiencing a significant amount of climate migration from heavily hit areas. So as the temperatures go up, that's going to increase. And now you've got mass movements of people trying to find some place where they can get by. Well, we've already seen, look at today's headlines. You see how divisive immigration has become as an issue, and now double that or triple that and really put the pressure on. And we can see that that might become a significant source of conflict, maybe, political conflict, maybe even military conflict could lead to all kinds of untoward consequences, such as human rights violations and the rest.
So interesting, Professor. So the nations affected the most would be along the equator, and also countries in the Gulf. Well, you can say all the way. Well, technically, I mean the percentage of population living all the way up north and in the south, it's very minimal. So therefore, in terms of percentage of population would be affected the most would be the countries and the people located along the equator. Am I correct, Professor?
Well, yeah, I think the Sahel is considered to be the most vulnerable now. But, if you look at what's happening in the Amazon, it's starting to deforest. It's getting too dry to maintain the rainforest. And that's even apart from all the logging that's taking place there and all the clearing for agriculture. Why would that not also be true of Central Africa, where you've got rainforests, extensive rainforests and the like? Why would that not also become? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if the studies show that what's happening in the Amazon will also happen, say, in Congo, which I believe is rainforested. But it stands to reason, I think, that you'll see significant changes further south as well. And what are some of the things that happen? Well, maybe if an area relies on a certain pattern of rainfall, the rain's coming at a certain time of the year and then abating at a part of the year and the like. Well, does climate change disrupt all those patterns? And thus, whatever kind of agriculture you were engaged in that region may not be any more feasible, may not be feasible any longer. So an adaptation then is to adopt a whole different way of farming, raising livestock and the rest, and that may or may not be possible. If it is, fine. Then we shift from being primarily rice growers to cattle farmers or whatever it means. And by the way, I did investigate Africa a little bit before I joined you, and a lot of the research that appears to me is focused on what they call climate smart agriculture. And that's the idea that we have to recognize that these changes are coming, that the ways that we used to farm and raise our livestock and so forth are not going to be workable any longer. And so we're going to have to adapt to that. We're going to have to adopt different ways of managing water. We'll have to adopt crops that are resilient to higher temperatures and less rainfall and different growing seasons. So people are thinking about this, and some of it's even being implemented, this climate smart agriculture. I know that I don't know whether that's also taking place around the rest of the world, but it's clearly happening in Africa. There's a lot of talk about that. So that I think part of that is just bringing in maybe more productive ways of farming climate change apart. Just, that maybe you could use genetically modified strains of wheat and rice and so forth, and increase your productivity, which then would deal with some of the malnutrition and hunger and poverty that afflicts the continent. But it's also geared towards trying to deal with the impact of climate.
Yeah. So on the part of migration and border security, how do you think the Europeans would deal with large-scale displacement due to migration? And we will see a securitization of the climate migration, similar to how Europeans handle, you can say, North African migrants or Sub-Saharan African migrants coming from North Africa, since the Sahel region is mainly it's made out of North African countries that actually are along the Sahel, which is not it doesn't have a very ideal climate for agriculture.
Right.
And so therefore, if they are affected the most, how do you think the Europeans will?
Well, how are they acting now? How are they reacting now to the growth of migration from Africa to Europe? People are drowning in the Mediterranean Ocean trying to get across the sea to Italy and Greece and Spain. The Europeans are trying to keep people out. Now, they're maybe not as belligerent as the current U.S. administration, but nevertheless, I don't think when migration patterns increase like that, when the numbers grow, that unless something really fundamental changes about attitudes and politics in the world, that host countries are going to be opening their arms up and welcoming people. And that may change. It could. I mean, I think this is also a product of other economic forces that are underway, that there's a feeling of a lot of being pressed. So countries turn towards economic nationalism and xenophobia and the like when they start feeling pressed. And that's been going on long before climate change. But nevertheless, all climate change would do is add to the magnitude of the problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to amplify those sentiments. So I don't want to be all doomy and gloomy, but if we continue on this trajectory, where are we headed?
That's a very good question. I hope you don't mind. I'm starting to.
No, you're good, sir.
And that was kind of where I left off in the book. I was sort of leaving it open because the scholarship leaves it open and because nobody really knows. I mean, here's the thing. If we do go to 4 degrees, that's been seen in the climate literature, and this is by climate scientists more so than social scientists, as absolutely catastrophic. That if we get to 4 degrees of temperature rise, that the climate will have changed so radically from what human civilization has thrived in for the last 5,000 years or so. And human civilization developed over, say, the last 10,000 years. And we did that all in this Holocene environment, this stable, moderate environment, climate that now seems to be coming to an end. And so if we go to 4 degrees and we enter a new era, climate era, like I say, the consensus is that basically spells the end of civilization as we know it. That, as one prominent climate scientist told me, I asked, well, what would it be like? And she said, well, it would be global Syria. And this was back when the Syrian civil war was really hot and underway. And this, which was, by the way, partly driven by drought, which could well have been partly caused by climate change. So, essentially a breakdown of society, civil war, and the like, and that this would happen on a global scale. So, do we have to be in that kind of a spot with 4 degrees? Well, human beings are pretty adaptable creatures, really. I mean, just the fact that we live in every different climate on the planet tells you that we could adapt to different types of prevalent climates globally, but we might be in a whole different type of social system. I mean, if we did it catastrophically, as I said, adaptation is going to happen whether we like it or not. We're going to either adapt to climate change chaotically, unplanned, probably violently, with lots of disruption and so forth, because we'll just be reacting to the impacts of all these changes that are going to take place in a fairly short period of time. Or we can plan it. We can say, well, we know that the temperature is probably going to go up about 3 degrees total, another 1.5 degrees. It's probably going to have these impacts on agriculture, and then we can be fine enough to say this part of the world, its agriculture is going to suffer. This probably won't feel too much difference in its conditions. And so we can kind of specify that, and we can start to think ahead. And we can plan ahead, and we can say, okay, well, let's start to move this society towards a different way of sustaining itself and move this one that way, and do that in a cooperative way where the finance is readily available and provided in adequate amounts around the world. What kind of a social system would do that? Would it be a social system of sovereign nation states all heavily armed and ready to go to war with each other, as we have now? Would be a system of global capitalism where making the most money and accumulating capital is the main objective, and that requires then cutting costs in every area, including labor, including safety, including protecting the environment? Would that be, or in a current iteration of global capitalism where global fossil fuel companies play such a big part and have so much political influence? Would that system be able to enact that cooperative, positive way of adapting to climate change as it becomes more and more acute? And that's the kind of question I think people are posing. Well, is it that civilization is not compatible with 4 degrees, or is it this civilization that's not compatible with 4 degrees? Is it that we need a different civilization, a different order? And then we can have civilization. In other words, we don't have to all go back to the Stone Age. I mean, that's one way we could adapt. We could just give up modern technology and modern and urban society and go back to peasant agriculture with a significantly reduced global population. Go back to, say, around the year 0 and have about a couple of 100 million people on the planet, or I think about 1800 we had 1 billion. So, you could do that. That's one way to adapt. The natural world might like that quite a lot. There'd be lots of forests and so forth that would come back pretty strongly. And and I'm sure the fish stocks would recover. The oceans would be teeming with fish again and all that. So that may well be an attractive way. And I think there are some folks that think that way. But otherwise, we're going to have some kind of a social system that is not addicted to economic growth, because that just keeps worsening the problem. That is not run by people who are driven only by their own bank accounts and their own lust for power. It's going to have to be people that think that human well-being and human needs come first, not that, and put those ahead. So that would be, that's why the Chinese model might gain some leverage in the future if ecological civilization for what is still communist China means an ecological socialism, global ecological socialism, then that would be one pathway out of it. Now, not everybody agrees that things are that stark. I had folks tell me, though, the future is capitalism with renewable energy. Capitalism is the system that works. It's the one we have. We're not going to overthrow it. It would be too costly and painful and bloody, I'm sure. But if we can just institute renewable energy and use government policy to take care of some of the unavoidable consequences, then we'll be all right. And I can't tell the future. I don't know which one of those is the most accurate, but I think it kind of lays out the possibilities. But by the way, before I pass on, I let that one go. There is one other perspective that I don't know how much leverage it's gained, but it's called deep adaptation. And their argument is, instead of trying to find ways to save this civilization through adaptation measures, building seawalls around our cities and so forth, just recognize that it's too late. There's no way that this system is going to head off the catastrophe. It's going to burn every drop of oil in the ground. The temperature is going to increase to an unbearable level. The systems that underpin modern civilization are not going to be compatible with that climate that's coming. And so we just have to prepare for what's coming next. Just admit that this civilization is finished, as the title of one of their articles says. This civilization is finished. So how do we hang on to what we want to preserve in human life and human society and rebuild on that after the crash? And that's deep adaptation. So that's another perspective on it altogether.
So, Professor, if I do agree, I think neither of us have a crystal ball underneath our beds, so we can't predict the future. So if 4 degrees is too late, what drastic new environmental realities will shape the focus on climate action and drive imminent shift in economic, political, and societal structures? I know it's a very subjective question.
What's going to shift the framework of policy to where we don't hit that 4 degrees?
Yes, sir. Do you think the shift might be at 3 degrees or 2.5 maybe?
Well, as I said, the Paris Agreement actually, as it was first structured with the initial set of commitments, would have put us at about 2.7. So that's high. So it's higher than that 2-degree threshold. But then if it stabilized there and you started, say, inching it downward after that, and this is what they call overshoot, that we're going to go past our targets, but then we'll be able to use policy to bring the level back down again. And so we hit 2.7 for, say, a few decades and then pull it back down to 2 and then hopefully back down to no increase relative to pre-industrial eventually. Okay. So that's now that's one way to look at it. The other is that that Paris Agreement also contained another clause, and that was what they called ratcheting up. That is, that the commitments of the countries that they made in 2016 and 2018 and whatever would be steadily revisited, and they would constantly be increasing their level of ambition to reduce greenhouse gases. So the target they set in 2015 for a reduction would then hopefully be met, and then they would look again at another target to bring it down even further. And so they would keep ratcheting up their ambition to make it so that the amount of greenhouse gases was lower and lower. Well, you can imagine what happened to that. We have more fossil fuel emissions now than we had in 2015, with exception of year 2 of COVID, when economic activity dropped off so much. It's been on a steady upward climb ever since Paris and before Paris, and nothing's really changed as far as the direction of the increase of fossil fuel burning. So, which is the major component of greenhouse gases. So, that ratcheting up never happened now. So if you can ask, well, if we can't even do that, which was a voluntary, moderate, pretty palatable kind of commitment to make. And we can't even do that. It kind of makes you wonder whether anything further could be done. Now, as far as adaptation is concerned, I mean, it has this going for it, I guess, if you want to say, and that's that people will start to feel the impact. If the farming practices no longer work, if the cities are too hot, if the rainfall is too uncertain, if the extreme weather events are too frequent, people will have to start taking measures. So now the problem with that kind of reaction is it's always a step behind, right? You know, if you're ready for the 100-year hurricane, and then the 100-year hurricane comes every 10 years, you're a step behind and you're going to experience a lot of damage. And so any effective adaptation is going to have to be proactive. It's going to have to anticipate what the conditions are going to be like down the road. And, you know, whether countries are able to do that, I think is still an open question. I think some of that's happening, but I wouldn't say it would be enough to prevent some pretty serious consequences if we ever did see that higher temperature. Now, as I said, more recent estimates of where we're headed by the end of this century put it at about 3 degrees. So we wouldn't be at 4 degrees in 2100. And that's because the Paris commitments have been weakened and because of the policies of some of the countries, plus experience, just looking at the track record and knowing that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions continues to grow. But that's not the end of the story. 2100 is used in the literature as kind of a policy horizon, as if everything will happen by 2100 that's going to happen. But if you look at some of the older research that was sponsored by the UN on this, they also include projections going out for the next 200, 300, 400 years. And there you see that, well, even if we did stay below 2.9 by 2100, unless we get on a completely different energy path, we're looking at hitting that 4 degrees, say, in 2150 or something like that. So, you know, I'll be long gone. Good luck to you. I'll be long gone. And by then, you know, another generation of people are going to have to deal with it. And so it's not like it just goes away in 2100. But that's the policy horizon. That's what people kind of put as the end point of maybe the furthest we can conceivably see is the end of this century. So probably what we're looking at is about 3 degrees. Right now, of course, we're at about 1.5. At the Paris conference, one of the other things they did was they say, we're going to set 2 degrees as our policy goal, but we're going to aspire to make it only 1.5. And so that would have been incentive then to do that ratcheting up and increasing your ambition and so forth. Well, we've already hit the 1.5. In 2023, I believe we surpassed it for the entire year. I didn't know quite what was going to happen in 2024 because of El Nino. In fact, we surpassed 1.5 again in 2024, if I'm not mistaken. And we could probably surpass it again. What that means then is that 1.5 is not a transitory one-year thing. It means it's the permanent condition. We're beyond 1.5, which was a policy threshold just 10 years ago. And so, you know, we haven't got much, I don't think, much good news to report on that front. But that's what drew me to adaptation as the more likely response. That's where I thought the action was going to be.
Well, Professor, before we conclude, I have one other question that is composed of 3 different questions, but all 3 of them are aligned.
Okay.
It's dealing with development and infrastructure. Many African economies are still industrializing, yet climate adaptation policies push them towards green energy transitions, you might want to call them. Is this a form of economic coercion, where Africa is forced to undergo industrialization in the name of climate goals directed by the West? In conjunction to that, do you see this new form as some Africans would like to call it as green colonialism, where Africa provides resources for Western green transitions but remains economically marginalized?
Yeah, there's no getting around the neo-colonial relationships. I mean, all kinds of exploitation takes place. I have to ask, though, I mean, is it really such a bad thing that Africa is pushed towards renewable energies? As I said, it seems to me that it's a good thing to not go through that phase of oil and coal and natural gas. If you could just jump right to what are now cost competitive renewable energies, and then you've got permanent infrastructure that's not doing any particular harm to not the same kind of harm to the environment. And, you know, the cost of installing that is getting lower and lower as well. Plus, you know, my experience in Bangladesh There was a lot of communities that weren't connected by road. They might, you had to take a boat to get to them and so forth. And so to be brought into the modern economy, to have a cell phone, for instance, link the country together. You didn't have to put up telephone wires to be able to call somebody. Well, same with the electrical grid. Wouldn't it be better in a country like that to have your own solar panels and wind turbines right there in the local community? And same, I would think, across Africa, where road access may be limited. There's pretty good distances, unlike Bangladesh, to cover as well. Locally focused energy forms that are non-polluting would be a good thing. So if the NGOs and financial institutions are funding that, what's just to complain about?
I guess the complaint, I'm not disagreeing with you. It's that they see fossil fuels as an economic emancipation, similar to, I guess, Gulf countries, you might say.
You mean the African governments in particular?
Yes, meaning that development through using natural resources, mainly oil and gas,
Right.
versus.
Yeah, and I noted earlier that some African countries are in fact pretty big oil producers themselves. The North African countries, obviously, and then of course the Gulf states like Nigeria, Guinea-Bissau, Angola,
Angola.
all major oil producers themselves, and so they probably have a bit of a different interest. They'd like to see oil and gas produced and sold on the market so that they can have the money for their economies and their development process. So yeah, you're right. It's going to have some sort of contradictory tendencies going on there. I don't know why, though, for a non-oil producing country, why being drawn into that global oil market is a form of emancipation. I'm sure somebody could make that argument for me, but I find it a little bit hard to see. Do you know why?
Yeah, maybe, I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
Maybe it could be using fossil fuels to divert it to green energy. That could be a possibility as well.
Well, and I mean, there may be just a kind of a sense that countries got rich on fossil fuels and they want to be a lot better off than they are. And so why should they be barred from using that quick and well-known, well-understood energy pathway to develop their economies? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would agree with that assessment. I think that probably the spread of renewables through Africa is not probably the greatest culprit when it comes to sustaining neo-colonial relationships. I think it's going to continue to be the use of Africa as a source of raw materials and primary products, the indebtedness, the capital outflow. This is one of I don't have current numbers on this, but from what I understand, capital outflow from Africa far exceeds the amount that's brought in. The capital outflow far exceeds the amount of foreign aid that's provided. So the poorest part of the world, some of those countries, not all, but some of the poorest countries in the world are actually sending money out to the developed countries. And that's that dependency and neocolonialism that's been present for centuries in the relationship of Europe and North America to Africa. So that's a big structural and political question that needs to be solved in its own right. I hope that climate policy could make a contribution in the right direction on that.
It's also a mental shift, to be honest with you. So, Professor, if you had to if you have to end this on a positive note, what would it be?
Well, sometimes it really is darkest before the dawn. And I think what we're seeing is that the crisis, the environmental crisis, the economic crisis, the social crisis that we are experiencing around the world is just becoming so acute. And now the steps that are being taken are so damaging to working people and middle class people and poor people that we're starting to see some kind of pushback on that, a significant pushback to where people are not really ready to just let the system be run by those who are most privileged and powerful without any accountability, without any limits. So I do see signs of a kind of renaissance of activism, and I hope that makes a big difference in regard to the looming climate crisis, because I've got a child, 19 years old. They're going to face this. Their generation is going to face this. And I don't want to be the generation that leaves that behind for young folks. So we have to do something.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for being an awesome guest. And hopefully we'll have you back soon on the Nuzuri Kahawa Report. Thank you for the Thank you for the amazing lecture, Professor.
And thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
No, thank you.